for being here. Thank you everyone for being here. It is my privilege to introduce today Dr. Alia Khalid, who is lecturer of comparative and international education at the Department of Education, University of Oxford. Alia's research focuses on how women in the South navigate their agency in highly constrained circumstances. Her specialized areas of interest are the capability approach, negative capability, epistemic paradoxicality and justice, and the promotion of knowledges, plural and southern epistemologies. Alia is actively engaged in issues around the politics of representation and knowledge production in the academia, and Alia is currently accepting her doctoral students also in the same area. Thank you so much for being here. Really looking forward to this very interesting presentation and to ask you questions. So Alia, how we will go about it is that you have around 25 to 30 minutes to yourself for the presentation, and then there is a Q&A session. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Taiba. I just wanted to say it's a privilege for me to be here, and I'm really looking forward to engaging more with such brilliant people in the whole room. I always say that even in learning environments, I learn so much more by the ways that in which different people process different ideas. So there's always a lot to learn, and I'm really looking forward to that. This is going to be like a prelude to one of the papers that I have recently published on silences. And I just wanted to say that when you talk about something like silences related with women's issues and struggles, and obviously I'm now based in, the North, or what we used to call the West, or still call the West, it's a controversial thing, and therefore it's a difficult. So I'm just engaging in these ideas, and I very much welcome everybody's feedback, your comments, either now after the session or later on if you'd like to send them to me. And this is going to be an introduction of that paper, and very briefly I'll talk about the different ideas that I introduced in that particular paper. So before beginning, I wanted to talk a little bit about my own positionality. And my positionality is not about who I am, what I've done, or where I am, but actually it's more about understanding and acknowledging my own limitations. And in a field like I mentioned, when I work with issues of gender and I talk about things like silence, and when I interpret silence as something that can be probably powerful or power yielding, this is very controversial and complicated, and therefore I need to also be accountable to myself in saying what my own positionality is. So the positionality here is just to sort of claim that limitation which it lies within from where I'm emerging, the kind of knowledge that I'm bringing and I'm emerging from. So I come from Peshawar. I arrived in the UK in 2015, and I did my PhD. I stayed, when I wanted to PhD, I was very much interested in looking at issues of gender in education. That was my main focus. And I did my PhD at Cambridge, stayed there, taught there for a bit. Then I came to Oxford. I've been teaching here. The reason why I'm mentioning these two institutions is because they have very strong colonial legacies. And when we talk about colonialism, we need to understand that colonial thinking is a lot about power, and it is a lot about the hegemons in the knowledge production realms. So when I came in here, like when you start your PhD or any research work, you are required to delve deeper into the literature that is already there on the topic, so as to avoid what we call recreating the wheel in a sense. So you try to engage with the knowledge that's already there, you get informed with that knowledge, and equipped with that knowledge, then you enter your field of work. Right. So the reason I mentioned these institutions and this kind of knowledge system is because this is the literature that I was coming from. This is the literature that I was engaging in. And there are many sort of debates and strong sort of literature that is being formed, scholarship being created around the issues and the politics of knowledge production, which is of a lot of interest to me as well. Now, what do I mean by knowledge production? It is exactly the question of what is it that we see as knowledge, and who has the sort of legitimacy of contributing to that body of knowledge, right? So historically, what we see is, because of the different structures, what has happened is that the knowledge repository of the world, it is populated by people, academics, and that exist in certain parts of the world. And I am also a part of that system, if I may acknowledge that. So what happens is that then there's little that is seen or comes out of other parts of the world, including Pakistan, for example. Now, one may argue that why is it that the other knowledges are not accepted or not entering here? Is it because people are not creating that? It's deeper than this particular issue, because there are barriers, there are structures that maintain that status quo and those hegemonies that are already there. So there are questions around, why is it that different knowledges don't come in? Why is that there's a gap in there? It's not that they don't come in, they do exist there, but actually, more a certain part of the world might have more of a right to populate that body of knowledge. Now, why this is important is, again, going to the point that I was sort of dipping in and out of this knowledge. Whatever was created in there, I was being informed by that knowledge before I went in. Now, one of the issues that I will probably touch briefly upon is the kind of idea of who we let in knowledge, who we let in to create knowledge. And that depends on how you see that person. So for example, if you're having a conversation with somebody and you want to learn about something, the learning that you will take back depends heavily on how you analyze that person. Do you see that person as a sensible, knowledgeable person who is producing knowledge that you can take back? Do you give that value and that respect to that person? If you do, then you will accept that knowledge, right? So a similar kind of situation also goes on and is critiqued in literature quite a bit. A big sort of scholarship coming out of that is to see, perhaps one of the reasons could be that this knowledge system doesn't accept the knowledge from other systems based on the fact that they're not given the legitimate, acceptance as knowledge, as strong knowledge that is being produced, right? So all of these issues were there. I was still using the same knowledge systems, same knowledge repositories. What I came across was another issue, because my work is basically focused on gender, right? And my particular field is comparative and international education, and also bits of international development. So what I saw was this issue of representation happening there. So when you look at this picture, and I'll come back to representation, what you see is there's a knowledge body. There is some kind of disconnection between how we see the other and we receive information from the other. What happens within the knowledge sort of hegemons, the system there, is that there are certain ways that people are seen. For example, we take the example of a girl child. Let's say girls' education in Pakistan, let's say girls' education anywhere in the world, especially in developing economies per se. So this phrase, girls' education or girl power, we are very familiar with that. And immediately as we hear this term, girl education, we have certain images in our mind. Some girls not getting education, maybe them coming into conflict with their environments, their cultures in order to achieve education. And also another idea of this weak girl that needs some kind of support. Somebody needs to come in to, help her at that immediate point. Now, this is an interesting point, and this separate from this, Edward Said would actually call this Orientalism of a certain sense. But if you come back to this idea of the girl, what happens is that things are started with good intentions. And we've seen that a lot of international organizations have come in, have given a lot of funds. Work has happened on girls' education per se. But what we also see is that there is a narrative that is kind of created around these things. Now, all of these, yes, Taiba?
Are you moving your slides? Because we can only see one slide over here.
No, it's the last point. I'm really bad at slide making.
Somebody asked me and I thought I could check with you. That's okay.
No, that's fine. There's not a lot in my slides usually, so I'm really bad at this skill alongside other skills that I'm bad at. So So the ideas of the girl child that I was coming back to, and I think this context is very, very important, is because it starts off with good intentions, good things start happening. But at the end of it all, if you start reading the literature and talking about these things, you see that there are different discourses that are formed around this girl and the girl's education, basically. And there are certain things. For example, one thing is that the girl will necessarily have to come in conflict with her environment or her culture in order to achieve education. Could be any elements in her environment, could be, any other restraints. And I'm not suggesting that that is not the case. Most certainly, in many cases, these are the situations. But you see, this girl is seen as a homogeneous singular. So this is just this girl from the global south that usually will have to come in conflict with her environments. It could be insecurity, it could be culture, it could be anything. And then this girl also needs to be saved. So those ideas, then what happens is that they enact certain kind of imageries about these contexts and about these things. So this is what people would call the issue of representation. So with time on the international level, what happens is that these people or other people that are not existing on this side of the globe are seen in certain ways. They're represented in certain ways. And so these issues, these problematics that are involved are particularly covered in the area of politics of representation. So I wanted to say that that is the background that I want to set myself against. I want to admit that I am based at a university in the global north, and I am based in a field of comparative and international education. So therefore, this is where I come from in the ways that I talk about the work that I also do. So when I started looking for or researching on this particular issue, I was very much interested. My focus was that of trying to understand the role of mothers in, or the capability of mothers in shaping their daughters' education in Pakistan. And indeed, I did find that a lot of literature did say that there was a positive relationship. For example, some kind of evaluations research would suggest that if the mother has spent more years in school, for example, you would see an association with the number of years spent by the daughter in or girls in school, or them completing the school cycle, or them spending more time on school-based activities, educational activities at home. So all different sorts of evaluations actually were pointing towards the fact that there is a positive relationship. But what was really interesting was that I was interested in the process. How does the social process of education work? Because it's much stronger because of the element of gender as well, the intergenerational element, the gender element, and the other intersectionalities that are also involved. So what I saw in this literature was a very sort of human capital kind of ideology of this mother. And I'm sure that a lot of you might have already come across human capital, but very simply, it talks about education as an investment in human beings with the likelihood or potential of increased sort of improved productivity in the future. So on the one hand, the idea was spend more on mothers, to equip mothers so that they become an asset and are able to invest in their daughters. On the other hand, mothers investing more on their daughters to actually, achieve these goals. Now, all of these ideas there's a lot of robust sort of research around it, and I'm not negating this, but this doesn't actually tell us a lot about the depth of the process and actually the way in which, and I always believe that social transformation happens very slowly, and it is buried in those processes rather than the outcomes that we are concerned with. So I saw a very sort of human capital ideology of this mother's role as a means to an end, perhaps, to reach somewhere. And Taiba may argue that capability approach actually came as a response to that means to an end distinction. So with all of this literature in the back of my mind, I set out to try and understand more about how is it that mothers shape their daughters' education, and I selected, central Punjab, some rural communities in central Punjab, and there were 30 families that I visited, and I interviewed multiple members within those families. But for the purpose of this particular paper, I only drew on the interviews that I conducted with the mothers. Now, the interview schedules were developed drawing on the capability literature, so there were certain concepts concepts and certain ideas that I borrowed from the approach and then operationalize that into my semi-structured interview schedules. And I used them to gain this information. Then I conducted firstly a thematic and then a narrative. So sort of an analysis of the whole stories of each mother and then comparing across those. A little bit about the methodology. Now, the data that I got from these different interviews, and I sometimes feel that data is a very reductionist term, but for a lack of a better term, I will be using this today. And drawing on certain ideas from the capability literature, I identified two things, for example, aspirations and the actions that mothers performed. So what I was looking for and the kind of things that the mothers shared with me was what aspirations they had for education, especially in relation with their daughters. Now, these aspirations did not necessarily have to be, very concrete. They could be their dreams, their desires, the way that they had been in the past, what had happened in the past, and what had they felt like, what was the present like, and what is it that they were requiring from the future. So a very future oriented. There was a whole temporal lens to it to see, were those aspirations actually going. And then within that too, they talked about things like what did they expect out of education, whether or not education, they saw it as a valuable thing, because we know there's a lot of literature around the harms that education done in a certain way can actually do to individuals as well. So all of those things were within those conversations that we had, but I had a very nice sense of the whole story and the temporality within their experiences. Now, for the sake of analysis, because obviously to connect all of these ideas to conceptual or theoretical or physical philosophical ideas, we need to have practical tools. So in order to understand the element of mother's role, which was very broad for me at that point, capability, I compared aspirations in relation with the different actions that mothers were performing. So the action needn't be like breaking out of a certain situation, for example, and that is one of the examples that I've used in the paper to clarify what I'm talking about. But these could be little things that they did as they went by. So as I read through the conversations I had with them, I listened to the conversations over and over. I was looking for what were the kind of aspirations at a particular point in time and what were they actually doing, any action that would lead them to sort of move towards those aspirations, to achieve those. So this kind of analysis was going side by side, looking at this on a life course kind of basis, not at one particular point, but actually looking at it across the time period. Now, the most interesting part is that when I also went on the field, I was really struck by how wrong I was, in the sense that the knowledge that I was coming up with. And Miranda Fricker calls this a moment of epistemic revolution, where she thinks that we come with our own knowledge, we've read lots of literature, we think we know everything that is out there, and we arrive there and we see that there are things happening that just don't make sense. They don't make sense because they have no sense to them. They don't make sense because we don't have the sort of required resources to make sense of what is happening. So we don't have the vocabulary, in a sense, coming from where we are. But what I saw was, if on the surface of it, you looked at the situations of these families and mothers especially, you would sometimes see that they were actually abiding by the gender norms. So they were key points in time where they were not resisting, actually very happily doing whatever was expected. I don't know happily or not, but they were actually abiding by those rules. So if you analyzed and if you wanted to look at any element of agency within the lives of those mothers, you would be held back, because obviously they were doing whatever was expected, or whatever the norms were expecting them to do. But there was something else. It wasn't it, because there was something that was happening in their lives that was very powerful, and I couldn't actually nail that with the vocabulary that I had. So then I came across some of the work by Saba Mahmood, a Pakistani-born philosopher, and who was based at Berkeley. And she did her research in Egypt, and she worked with a women's organization that was very active during the Islamic revival movement in Egypt. So what she saw was really strange. A similar thing, because she saw that they were abiding by all of those restrictions. Some of those restrictions were really not good for them, for their own freedom, for example. But then they were doing some very powerful things, using up those resources in a particular way. So she came up with this idea of this agency, this particular agency that she says should be very open-ended. She wants agency to be very much related with how things are happening, and making that decision about the agency then in relation with how the changes are happening in people's environment and how people are actually navigating those environments or interacting with those environments. So she describes agency as a capacity for action. And she talks about, this particular agency, which cannot be described with the for example, the Western feminist or the liberal feminist ideas that we rely on, of resisting, of fighting back, of fighting against the structures. So she says there are situations when we can't explain the agency of women when we come with that particular vocabulary. Then she describes that agency is actually unique because it is the capacity for acting or action in historically, those spaces that are bound in relations of subordination historically. So, for example, if a culture does not allow a certain thing to happen, and that is a historic event. Now, again, coming back to the point that a person not being able to say what they want to say at all the time is not the ambition. So for a government, or as people who believe in social justice, obviously we do want a context that is similar to the others, equal, and a place where everybody can say whatever they want to say. So that is not what I'm trying to say, is not this setting this not as a gold standard, but saying that there are still things happening. Remember, we talked about that girl who becomes Black feminist theorists actually describe as a hypervisible object, but an invisible subject. So for example, when you talk about girls' education, that issue is so huge in the world that we listen to it and we immediately think of things. So that's a hypervisible, but then the identity of the girl is like an object. So it's an object. But when you talk about their agency or what they're doing within those contexts, then that is kind of invisible. So that kind of vocabulary. So she talks about how, when conditions historically are those of in which relations of subordination exist, then there are very unique forms of agency that actually come by. And that type of agency we can't describe with the help of the tools and instruments and research analytical tools that we are accustomed to using. So then she says, then there should be a space for an open-ended kind of agency. But how do we describe that agency? That's very complicated, because how do we give voice or we understand what is happening? Now, some scholars have said that there is an element of critical openness that is required, like Miranda Fricker again talks about critical openness on the part of the researcher and also practitioner and also policymaker, but more so on the part of researcher, where we need to engage with certain kind of openness to what is happening, being very ready, understanding the limitations of our own knowledge, and being ready to have those epistemic revolutions basically when we arrive there. But I was being informed by this literature and some other literature as well. And then I came across this very interesting thing, which I noticed that there was silence happening in the lives of these mothers. Now, silence is really interesting because I saw it happening in multiple ways, but two particular ways. So the first one was very literal silence, where some of the mothers actually talked about how they used silence to achieve certain ends. So as a method of communication. And one example is this mother who talks about how she wanted something and then she stayed quiet, silent treatment for some time, and eventually she got what she needed without even having to say anything at all. So in a sense, that kind of thing. Now, literature, a lot of literature, for example, work by Jane Parpart, Swati Parashar, also talk about this particular element. And I'm also editing a book on silences with Jane and other colleagues, which builds this further. But they talk about going sort of unpacking this binary of silence and voice. So usually in feminist work, when you talk about silence, it refers to that of violence. So silence would definitely mean that there is violence somewhere. And I 100% agree that even in the context of Pakistan, the kind of issues that women are having, and Pakistan is not the only country, almost everywhere in the world, similar things happen. That is actually, silence is a sign of violence. But these scholars say that how about we start and make it a more paradoxical concept? And we see that perhaps silence, yes, can be by virtue of violence, but at the same time, maybe silence can also be a way of expressing certain things. So in that sense, we're not saying that silence is a heroic condition, but we're saying that it's paradoxical. It's a little bit ambiguous. And so therefore, they talk about going into that paradoxicality of silence and voice and breaking out the binary. And binary vision is something that a lot of scholars are now trying to move away from. So in my work, in the paper, what I saw happening was another type of silence, which I called as silences in my work, basically. And what I saw happening, and in this sense, I use silence in a very figurative sense. For example, silence could mean not wanting to talk or choosing not to say something. It could be the withdrawal of voice. It could be the withdrawal of action. For example, refusing to engage in a certain way. It could be the withdrawal of your aspirations. For example, if you want your parents to buy you something, and if you see that they're in a very bad mood, you will withdraw from that situation, and you will hold back your aspirations for that point in time, and you'll wait for a proper time when you engage with this. So what I saw happening was something very similar. So there was an disengagement and a re-engagement throughout the lifespan, according to the changing context and the changing requirements of these sort of mothers in their environments. So by disengaging, what I mean is that they would hold back on their aspirations, on their actions, on their on other things, on their voice, depending on the situation. And there's a very interesting example that Jane and others actually draw on, and their insecurity studies. They say simply, you think about voice in the way of saying something. If there's a war situation and somebody just comes out and starts saying all of these things that they want to say, they will be shot. They will put themselves in danger, and they will not, reach anywhere. So what do? They hold back, they go back, they organize, they mobilize, and they come out when it's the best point in time, they think is the best point in time to achieve the maximum goals that they want to. So in a similar sense, across the life course, what I saw was that there was a disengagement, refusing to engage in all these three ways and other ways as well. And then there was a re-engagement when they thought the time was ripe and the environment was as such that they would be able to achieve certain kinds of goals. So there was a very smart thing happening there, because if you analyze throughout the life course, disengaging, re-engaging, disengaging, re-engaging, certain times, and one of the examples that I have used in my paper, it was a very powerful breaking away from a lot of things and then achieving and transforming lives. But a lot of times no transformation happened. But my question then is, if no transformation happens, can we disregard all of that strategy? Can we disregard all of that agency that is already happening in the process? So I guess remaining open would also mean to give value to these knowledges and these kinds of systems that are in place and the agency that is emerging in many different ways. So Arsalan, how am I doing in regards to time? I forgot to put my timer on. I'm just almost done.
You have time, Alia.
Okay.
It's already present. 5-6 minutes. Yeah.
Thanks, Taiba. So, and I'll give you an example. For example, there was a mother who had young children. And I remember there are many barriers in the environment, I agree. And for many women in the world, there are. And so basically the schools, there were some schools nearby. And, because of many other issues, and I always argue that even if we challenge patriarchy, we need to also consider the intersectionalities, the economic barriers and problems and security issues for girls as well. But so her kids weren't allowed to go to school, and her identity card was actually used to be with her husband. And she sat down and she started telling me about this. And she said, I have two daughters. Oh, I went to school when he went to work, and the teacher said that I have to bring the ID card for them to be enrolled in school. So I stole away my ID card from the cupboard. I took them there. But they just went there for a few months, and then they came back because obviously there were other issues, resource issues with the schools. Teachers weren't there and they weren't interested anymore. Now the girls have come back. If you look at this example, it's an example of no success, basically. But she says to me, but I am just sitting and waiting. My youngest is growing up and there's a school that's opening nearby. So I'm getting things together to actually put him in that, because I think that will be more practical. I'll be able to go and, inquire if there's something going on. So sometimes I argue that in a lot of times when we talk about people's struggles and even marginalized communities' struggles, sometimes we are too fixated on what happens at the end. And the process is lost therein. And I always say that social transformation happens as a result of that process that continues and goes on, and then resultantly something happens. But not to minimize that sometimes the situation is as such that a certain other population needs to come out. They have to protest. They have to break down these barriers that are very hard to break. But many struggles actually happen simultaneously on very different levels. And as scholars, it's important to recognize and acknowledge all of those struggles as well, even if they go against the way that we are, used to thinking about things. So I just wanted to conclude on the fact that just bringing back to the discussion on that we did about knowledge production, about representation, bringing it back full circle to those ideas to see there's a lot of very rich work that is being done in this area. Miranda Fricker, for example, talks about epistemic injustice. And what she means by this is, as we know, epistemology is the way that we interact with this world and the knowledge that we gain from this world as a result of that. So she talks about this element where we don't give enough credit to the speaker or to the people, and we don't see them as knowledge producers. When this happens, what happens is that we don't take away what they're trying to communicate, or we take away whatever we have in mind based on the knowledge that we already have in a particular context. And so she talks about it in terms of epistemic injustice, to say that that's an injustice. So what my paper does is actually not to introduce some very sort of cool, innovative way of analysis and saying that, this is a new way of analysis, but it is actually a question, a critique on myself and other researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and it's a call to say that we need to remain open when we enter certain fields, and we need to acknowledge that there are limitations in the way that we see the world. That needs to be recognized before we enter the field. Now, coming back to the sort of field and of the CIE, comparative and international education, and I always look at it from the perspective of the globe and how they see different things, I would like to mention some work by Boaventura Santos. So Santos has some very interesting work, but he builds up on this idea. So he talks about globalization, and he talks about this global north, or or the Western Europe, basically. And he says that they are mired with abyssal, what he calls abyssal thinking. And he says what this means is that this global north draws a very strict boundary between their knowledge and the other knowledge. So their knowledge is different from the knowledge of the other. So the description of the other's knowledge is in relation with the self, and the self is seen as superior, is seen as the ultimate sort of knowledge that needs to be, created, and that needs to be recognized. And so he says, as a result of this, what happens is what he calls epistemicide. So he says, then it's a fault, it's a problem, in the words of Miranda Fricker, epistemic injustice or epistemicide, where actually these knowledges are not led to enter these realms, right? Now, it doesn't mean that there is somebody actively stopping these things to come in. But what certain post-colonial scholars, for example, argue is that there are structures in place that maintain this status quo and those hegemonies. They are systems that are already in place that will continue to do this. Lots of other things are also involved: neoliberalism, the new capitalist kind of wave in the world, and all of these things are also involved. But the basic idea, coming back to, as an international scholar or somebody, for example, if we wanted to publish something, we would rather go for the journals that are usually located in the global north, because they're seen as peer reviewed, they're seen as higher in the hierarchy of, basically journals, etc. So we have to go for those journals to publish so that our work is recognized, right? But then if you look at the history of these publishing houses as well, there's a very nice book by Sylvia Tamale, in which who's a Black scholar, she talks about, that politics of publishing. And she talks about how different publishing houses in Africa, they were bought out by other publishing houses because they're based in those contexts, and there's politics around the ways that that is seen. And if you and so these kinds of issues are inherent. It's not an active process, but it is, in a sense, that is being sustained in the environment. So so coming back to all of these ideas and saying then, what my initial point was, looking at all of those structures, I did my own research, and I found that indeed there are ways in which there are disconnections between the ways that knowledge coming from, for example, Pakistan is seen and it is recognized. And so therefore, I was very happy to find that there are scholars who are building up this wealth of literature around these issues. So again, coming back to my main point of the paper was to come back to, and when I critique in the paper, I critique myself. And in other words, I critique all the scholars who are either from the North or scholars like myself who are publishing in those places and situated in those places. So come back to say, to be aware of these politics and to be aware and, enter fields with an open mind. And I will stop here. I have a very interesting story of a mother. And what I've tried to do in the paper is I've tried to operationalize this concept of silences. How is it that these strategies are happening? And I've tried to analyze that with the help of this story of these mothers. If you would like to read the whole story, I think I won't be able to do justice to it here. Please do feel free to go back to the paper and read it out. And hopefully there's another paper coming out, which is about a similar connected concept, which I can share later with Taiba if somebody's interested. But I would like to conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alia, for the really excellent presentation, awesome discussion, and amazing ideas. Thank you very much. We would very much like to have your paper and the references. If you could share with us, we can circulate among us. So the floor is open for questions, and I'm just looking through if there is a question already out there. I think Dr. Shazia Evan had a question, and she was talking about the interpretation of silences. Shazia, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tamim. Hi. Hi,
hello,
Alia.
Lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too. So I am very new to the SOE, and I am superbly impressed with these edu talks that Dr. Tayyiba actually organizes, and we get to meet academics like you. So thank you very much for the talk. And I was intrigued for a couple of reasons. One, that I am trying to wet my feet in comparative education, and try to kind of even develop a course around it, but also the topic of how, I think I made a note on the homogenous singular woman or the girl from the global South, and kind of the interpretations around it. So my question was, when you started talking about silence and how silence is either used for or against, whatever we or the woman is trying to achieve. So my question is, does that depend on also how silence is interpreted? So for example, just to give you a little bit of background, I come from Son Valley, a very kind of a very conservative village-like environment, but at the same time, women are highly educated too, but then on the other end of the spectrum as well. So the silence is interpreted as oh, she's angry with how the things are going around, and she is interpreted as that angry woman all the time who doesn't want to participate in conversations. Or if you were silent and you didn't ask for anything, how could you expect us to know what you want? So I just wanted to know how you kind of looked at those interpretations. So she interprets it differently, but then how the Sas or the Nand or the sister or the Devrani, Jatani, and probably their own daughters, how they interpret that silence, that could have different meaning for her, right?
Thank you so much, Shazia. That is a wonderful, wonderful question. And it slightly also touches on some of the things that I usually have critically engaged in. And I'm really I'm mind boggled by some of the issues that come by. But you were absolutely right about the silence. And like I said, before going into the interpretation of silences, the initial understanding and very acknowledged understanding of silence is that of violence. So silence is usually imposed on you. And historically on women, silence has been imposed in that sense. So there is that recognition. Now, if we talk about the interpretation of silence within, let's say, a data set, for example, when I was reading out all of those stories, how I interpreted that, that's a different thing. And obviously, that's only one perspective of a certain thing. So I was looking at it from the perspective of the mothers only, and the way that they described different things and the way that they acted. Now, silence, no, none of them actually said that they were being silent, but there were patterns that I was seeing there. Ways in which they were either silent or they were refusing to engage, intentionally refusing to engage, right? Now, that doesn't mean that that is the ideal way of sort of communicating. But that also doesn't mean that Pakistan, which is a huge country, and every household, which is entirely different from the other, can be seen in the same light. Right? So there is a lot of complexity going on in the way that things are making any meaning. And that may depend on that situation with, let's say, the Sas and the Nand. That may depend on the situation where the culture sees silence as a sign of something. For example, there are cultures within Pakistan that celebrate death, whereas there are others where we cry and we mourn at funerals, etc. So the interpretation really depends on that particular context at that particular time. So if we talk theoretically about understanding and interpreting silence, it will have multiple facets. It will not have one shape, one form, but I guess the idea, so for example, in my paper, if you connect this idea of interpreting silence with what I did in the paper, then there was a certain angle that I took. But like I always say, that doesn't mean that, this is a very innovative approach to analysis, for example. I don't claim that at all. But actually what I claim is, for example, if somebody enters this environment, your village maybe, or that family, which is in which a lot of politics is actually happening and a lot of oppression also happening, when they enter that house, they should enter with an open mind. They should enter to listen to the perspectives, to see how things are happening, and they should remain open to be informed by the context that they're moving into. Similarly, if we talk about your own community, if they enter, they should make an effort to try and understand, what is happening there, what are the narratives, what are the historical discourses, are they negative, are they positive, what are they doing in terms of that person. But when you're doing research, you take a position, you look at a certain problem from the perspective of a certain entity. It could be an institution, it could be the mother. So in my research, that was the mother. But the main point of the argument was to remain open to different ways of seeing this. Now, this also brings me, Shazia, to this thing that actually I have been thinking about and I have no answer to it. For example, when I argue for silence, what am I doing? Because there are situations in Pakistan where women are actually silenced. So then it's a moral question coming back, an ethical question coming back at me to say, the realities of some of the women in Pakistan are completely different, right? But then we also have to consider that I come from that discourse, that international discourse that sees things in a certain light. And I see historically how people like me are actually seen in that light and the literature that is constructed around it. And although there's no answer to this, but also my understanding usually is that there can never be a perfect way of interpreting certain thing. But what is important is for you to remain open to say that I can be wrong, and anybody who has lots of knowledge can always be wrong. So how do I interpret this situation according to the best possible way, according to the changing circumstances, the situation of the people, and my limited knowledge at that point in time? And like I always say, it always happens in layers. So for example, we cannot discount the fact that struggles are needed. Radicalism is needed in a lot of ways, and people are being violated like that. But at the same time, we can't expect a woman who's trapped in a house where she might be burned if she says something. We can't, as an outsider coming from abroad, we can't expect her to speak out, because that is the only way she can show her agency, and no other ways is acceptable to us. Thank you. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
You did, and more. So thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you, Alia. I can see Vajia's question. Vajia, can I request you to ask a question?
Sure. Thank you very much, Alia, for an excellent
Hi,
presentation.
Vajia.
I'm a teaching fellow at LAMS, so I really appreciate how you brought about your positionality at the beginning of the presentation, and how it in fact inherently affects the process of your knowledge creation. So thank you for doing that. And I really like that you brought on the post-foundational theorists with De Souza Santos and Escobar. So going to your concept of epistemologies of the South that you discussed, do you have any examples of how you incorporate indigenous sources of knowledge in your work, including in the study that you presented or other work that you do in order to counteract?
Thank you so much, Vajia. So I'm very, I must say, I feel that I'm very, so I'm very small in this scenery in a sense. So I think that I'm not there to suggest the knowledges of the South, because they're so deep, so diverse, they're so rich that I will never be able to encapsulate that richness. Where I sit on the spectrum is I tend to deconstruct the rigid knowledge understandings of different disciplines. So which is why I talk about epistemic paradoxicality, because I really believe that there's a little role that I can play there to deconstruct these ideas, very rigid ideas of the way that Santos says, that strict boundary of the knowledge of the self and the knowledge of the other. And I delve very much deeper into, and I draw on these sort of that literature on the ways in which the knowledges of the South are not incorporated even now into the knowledge repository. Even now, all of these terminologies and discourses still prevail. So as an academic, my little role that I think I can play is in unpacking that. But while I do this, while I talk about how inefficient these ideologies are, and they do not, they're not, in a sense, they're missing out, because they don't have the capacity to let these knowledges in. At the same time, then I argue for these other ways of knowledge coming in. Now, I don't ever fixate myself on one particular kind of knowledge, but I fixate that onto the instrument, the researcher, to say that it can be multiple. So today you see indigenous knowledge systems as one, and indigenous people's issues as particular to one point in time. Tomorrow they may change, and their ideas may change, their knowledge may radically change to something else. You should be equipped to make space for that change as well. And therefore, it's upon you to remain open. And that's more of a question basically on the Western hemisphere. It's more of a question on the North. So abiding by Santos's ideas, I don't usually call them global North and South. It's an ideology, it's a South. And there's a North, and there can be Souths within the North as well, as you must already know. So I don't know if that's an answer, but I feel that I never have answers.
No, that was excellent. Thank you so much. Pleasure listening to you.
Thank you, Atia. Wonderful question.
I'm looking for more questions. Please put them in the chat or raise your hand. And by the time, other questions come, I have a couple of questions. My first question is related to your use of aspirations. So you're also using this capability approach, and you're using aspirations. So how do they together fit in? So are we talking about aspirations in terms of valued goals. So I'll put the questions out there and then you can answer them together. The second question is, I mean, this is a fascinating idea that we sort of, the silence itself is a manifestation of agency. So we're looking at different manifestations of agency over here. Do you think somehow it creates a problem in terms of when we are talking about marginalization or something? It's like, you know, people always have agency. Yes, they do have agency, but the kind of agency they have might differ. And I'm just saying, when we are thinking of any policy interventions, again, it takes me back, you know, I'm very, very sort of like cognizant of what you said, of this girl as an object. So without making her sort of objectifying her, but sort of like enabling her to be sort of somehow, is there something I can do? So how do I sort of like, where do I come in? Because there is this manifestation of agency. She already has it. She's already empowered in one way or the other. And this is a question that I'm sort of like dealing with. And then the third question is a very simple one. Just wanted to ask you a little bit about your choice of households. How did you go about it? So over to you.
Thank you, Taiba. Brilliant questions. And I was sweating a little bit, thinking that Taiba is going to come up with some capability-related questions. But those are brilliant questions. And thank you for the other brilliant questions as well. But so your first question about aspirations is really interesting, because the concept of functionings within capability literature. So what do they want to be and what do they want to do? So these are the two kind of things, right? So within the concept of aspirations, they talk about their own desires, what they would like to be, what they would like to do and become is another element. So the become element, then I draw on the capability idea of agency to say that agency is sometimes related with the benefit or welfare of your loved one. Then that's what Sen talks about, kind of. So the construct of aspirations is really interesting, and there's more work that Joan DiGiugieri has done and Ina Conradi, you must know, in the approach have actually done on this. But aspirations is really interesting because it draws out the past, it makes people talk about the present, and it makes them engage with the future. And they talk about those desires, they talk about what they want to do, how they want to be in the future, for example, the way that they see themselves and their families in the futures, their children in the future. So it's what DiGiugieri calls as alternative futures. They dream of alternative futures as a result of education. And that's also a very interesting element, because when I was talking about these aspirations, there's always this tension in the literature to say, when do you cross the line and the aspirations become unrealistic? And when is that, you remain on this side? And so what is really interesting here is that if you analyze, you will see that oftentimes people know what they're talking about. So for example, women would tell me, if she has education, she'll have a good future. And I couldn't understand. And I would say, but, in your neighborhood, even men don't have any jobs, they've done college, or some of them have gone to uni, they don't have any jobs. So why do you think that this is going to happen? And quite a few times you would be surprised, I came across this term where mothers started saying, azad ho jasi. And I used to say, azad kya? So one of them actually held my hand against hers, and she used to work in the brick kilns, and she held her hand against mine, and she said, look at the difference. She said, if she has education, she has this one chance that she might be somebody aside from what she's supposed to be in the house. Look at this difference. This is the difference that I can actually make in her life if I follow this up. So sometimes I feel that we lose sense of, how sensible people can be. And the epistemic revolution that I had was basically on the fact that many of the mothers who were doing these fantastic things, they had never set foot in the school themselves. They had never been there. And I am coming here thinking, oh my God, she has education, so she'll have an effect on her daughter's education. But that wasn't the case. I was proven wrong. So that is the answer to the first question about aspirations. That's how I drew on the approach. And actions, it had to be supplemented with some kind of action to see that, because there's all this debate about autonomy and how, actions are related. So all of that needed to be, covered to see what was happening in their lives. Now, that's the first one. The second one about you said about the harm of silence and the practicality of using it, for example, in policy work. And what do we do if we understand that these girls are functioning in these environments? So one of the things is actually, the first point is very key. Because if you blindingly just stick with silences and you feel that it's a very cool analytical framework, for example, you will miss out, and you might miss out. You would do the same thing like we're intending not to do, coming with a certain knowledge and imposing that knowledge on the context. There's a harm that you may miss out on the way that it is actually bringing violence to the lives of many. So I guess it's always a sensitive issue. And when I write about these issues, I'm always very cautious, and I'm like sweating, and I'm like really scared and nervous about that. So that thing that we'll have to be really careful about. About the practical bit, in my own humble capacity, what I'm currently working on is trying to, from the international angle, I'm trying to argue for the idea of a learner, not just a girl and one entity within a structure which is usually doing whatever it is doing, but rather looking at individual as embedded in spaces. So when we, as policymakers or international organizations, when we want to do something for a learner in a particular context, we need to see that learner as embedded between a space, and that space is psychological, aspirational, as well as it's physical, it's economical, it's social, and everything else, and political, economic, and all of those things are happening around it. So the concept, the theoretical concept that I'm trying to construct there is draw on systems, as well as some kind of ideas of Homi Bhabha, to talk about liminality, and to say that there are structures, but the structures are not separated from the individuals, and there's some navigation happening within that. Now, how do we account for what is happening within those spaces, and how is it that we see that individual interacting with that space? That's the tricky part. You can talk about it. So very recently, I'm doing a small project in which we are doing a scoping review, and we're trying to find out if we were able to analyze these different layers that within which learners lie. And we were wanting to talk about how the learners are interacting and doing things in these spaces. What kind of data sets are already there? What kind of evidence is already there that can help us to construct that analysis? To say, just like when multidimensional poverty index was being created by Sabina El-Khairi, she looked at all around at the data sets to see what was available out there. So I think that's the preliminary exercise, to see whether or not there is some evidence that we can use. What kind of evidence can tell us about the agency of individuals? What kind of outcomes, what are they doing, what is happening in the social element of that society? How do we get that knowledge? So conceptualizing that to trying and understand, how is it that the people are actually functioning in this context? From the purpose of a policymaker, though, I have done some connected work on, and Taiba, you might have heard about it, negative capability. And what I have done is, so Elaine Unterholter talks about this idea of negative capability, where she says that it's nothing negative. It is basically the ability of people to have their dreams, to excel, to move towards their targets, even if they are embedded within contexts that are very hostile, that are very limiting, that, unfreedoms, that take their freedoms away. Even then, so she begins this idea of what kind of agency capability does a person have in that context, because we see that in a lot of contexts, girls who have really been suppressed because of gender issues, usually girls are the ones that have to shatter glass ceilings, we see that they go very much ahead. So they're able to somehow, the more pressured you are, you somehow get that training of being able to do more in difficult circumstances. And and we see there are cases. They might be rare, but they are there. So she starts constructing this idea. So in one of my papers, which is under review with the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities, it constructs a framework, analytical framework, and brings these ideas together to say, how can we analyze a situation to say how people are functioning in this context? And so therefore, just like the capability literature, there are layers of analysis. You do the context analysis, you do the aspirational analysis, then you see, what is happening in the core of it. So it's one of the ways of operationalizing that. But then again, coming back to these kind of conceptual frameworks, etc., I'm always conscious that, you can't fixate these ideas, but you need to find one way or another of being able to speak to broader audience, for example, and talk in terms of policy, for example. So that is one of the attempts that I have made. About the choice of the families, I went about in this process where I basically used mixed methods, but my PhD was very much qualitative. So what I did was I used the ASER data set, and I did a cluster analysis of mother's education and daughter's sort of education status. They have indicators for those. And I tried to see the different variations where, mother would have education or higher education and the daughter isn't at school, for example. And I did all of that analysis for different communities, so different sort of village communities. And then I identified certain ones where these things were coming out very strongly. So I made a list of, what were the villages, and obviously you can tell it could be that no schools are around, maybe, so that they can't send. So there are reasons behind it. It's not like there are no reasons, but I did an analysis. I drew up certain lists, and then I identified different places where I had to go. So this data was collected from 3 villages. And then once I was in the village, I was basically just doing random sort of selection of these cases. Sometimes they would be through references, for example, in certain contexts where you couldn't find mothers who were highly educated or educated beyond primary, then you could I went to a school, I spoke with the teachers, and I asked them if they could identify somebody, and I could actually go there. So I went through that kind of process to select the houses. Sorry for the long answer. I can never be concise.
Thank you so much, Alia. Thank you for the fascinating talk. It was very informative, very interesting. And thank you for helping us think about these things: silences, agency, epistemology, and injustices that might be embedded within it in different ways. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here. And Alia, we would love to read your paper, and please do share your resources with us.
I definitely will.
Very much. And we'll be in touch with you, inshallah.
Thank you. Taiba, can I request that the chat is saved and sent to me, because I wasn't able to read the chat, and I would really like to read, what people are saying, and if they have any further queries. And I really appreciate everybody coming in, especially in your Rosa, especially when it's late afternoon there. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Taiba.
Thank you, Alia.
Hope to stay in touch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.